Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to our virtual apartheid unit. So we've already done a little bit of our background and getting people ready and getting a decent overall understanding of what the timeline of this is looking like. So we've got some of this going already, but of course we are going to have to break it down. We're going to have kind of three overall PowerPoints on this. We're going to have our background PowerPoint, which is just kind of making sure we have an understanding of what's happening. We're going to have our actual nature of apartheid PowerPoint, which is going to be what apartheid was and the legislation behind it. And then we're going to have our resistance to apartheid PowerPoint, which will be kind of just the resistance to apartheid, how people are going to stand up against that. I am still going to get you guys some daily Amelia going on because I think everybody needs some daily Amelia. This is her giving her dog a walk. She also likes to stop and pick up every twig we find, so she kind of makes a nest for her dog, and then she gets really mad if we try to clean up that nest. So that's my daughter with her own baby, I guess, giving him a walk. Let's talk about apartheid. It's not as fun as my daughter taking a walk. So IB is really weird when it comes to what they focus on with apartheid. Let me do an alt tab here just to make sure that we are recording, because I would not want to do a 40-minute PowerPoint and then not have it recorded. So we got that going. It looks like we are indeed recording, so we will be good to go. Oh, too far ahead. All right, so going back. IB is really weird with how they do apartheid, because apartheid doesn't really fall apart until the late 80s, early 90s. But IB only looks at it until 1964, which is kind of a low point in the anti-apartheid movement. So I don't know what the thought process is behind that, aside from maybe it somewhat aligns with the end of the civil rights movement that people pay attention to. But it's a very odd way of looking at it. So, I mean, this is what the IB focuses on. This is directly from their apartheid section and what they look at. So, petty apartheid, grand apartheid, all the segregation going on here, then the protests in action. We got a decent number of these significant people and groups covered already. In fact, I believe, if I recall correctly, I put all of those into that activity. So all of these should be things that are familiar to you. This is basically what they want you to know by the end of this. Now, most of this PowerPoint, the background, is actually none of this. But as I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, it's really weird and not effective to teach history in a vacuum. So if we just jumped right into 1948 without any of this background there, you would not have a working understanding of what's going on in South Africa. And I do not believe you could understand apartheid without having that understanding of the background behind it. So although IB does this weird approach, we're going to do some extra background. I'm also going to every now and then kind of jump ahead of 64, and I kind of, when we get to resistance, for example, I'll give you a really quick rundown on how it all ends, because it's silly to me to get halfway through something and then just, that's it. That's all we're going to talk about. What if you did World War II and you just got right up to where Hitler had blitzkrieged through a bunch of countries and taken over all of Europe except for Britain? Then you were and that's it. That's the end of our World War II coverage. Okay, sure, whatever. So background. We start with colonization. We could go even further back, but I don't think it's super important for you to know before colonization. The really, really bullet point version of it in this one sentence here is there's this thing called the Bantu migration, or Bantu. I'm going to mispronounce so many words in this, you guys. I'm sorry in advance. In Africa, where basically Africa is in a weird spot because Africa is the origin of humanity. That is where humans came from. But it's also incredibly not really good for living. It's full of dense jungle, so it's hard to get around. That also makes it really hard to farm. And this, of course, is the center of Africa. It's also humid. It's full of horrendous diseases like malaria. If you go further north, you get more of the Sahara. Then you get the desert, I should say. But you also get some grasslands and stuff like that. But then you have to deal with the fact that it's full of lions and rhinos and all of these very not friendly animals. There's not really anything you could domesticate and really use, horses or cattle or stuff like that. So basically, it's all the things that you would need to start a society it's kind of like the opposite of that in Africa. So even though Africa is the origin of humanity, most of Africa didn't really get rolling until way, way later. And by the time the Europeans show up, like they're just starting their society more or less. So the Bantu migration is this movement of African tribes throughout Africa, generally moving further south and further east. And as they move, they make more and more tribes. You get more and more language groups, but it's all this like core base group together, and it brings people throughout Africa. And so South Africa being, the very bottom tip of it, we don't really get that like presence of multiple African tribes until like 900 to 1300 CE. That's pretty damn late in the game for them to really start getting set up. So the Dutch show up, about 300 years after that 1300 CE point. They show up on the Cape of Good Hope, and they're actually not really at that point interested in it for its like presence in Africa. What they're hoping for is, the Dutch East India Company. Guess where their focus is? That's East India. I know that's very confusing because it's not actually India, although it's partially also India. East India is actually Southeast Asia. So what they're really interested in the Cape for is if you're coming from Europe into Southeast Asia, you have to go all the way around Africa. And the coast of West Africa is not a good place to stop. It's full of like rocky cliffs and like really bad terrain for like landing. There's no really good harbors or ports to pull into. So you basically have to go all the way past West Africa, and then you hit the tip of South Africa, and you need to resupply. You need water, you need food, you need all the supplies you would need to get going. So if you can have, a little bit of an outpost there for specifically resupplying, that's really good if you are doing trade with East Indies. So that is what the East India Company is looking for here. However, as their presence there grows, because you can't just have a settlement, right? Like, where are you going to get the supplies from? You need people that are farming, you need people that have, like, what if it gets attacked? You need, defense there. So this settlement keeps on growing and growing and growing, and you get this group called the Boers, who are going to decide that the rules from the Dutch East India Company are way too strict. They're not allowing them to live the lifestyle they want to live, and they would prefer to pack up and go. So they decide they're going to start their own independent farms. They're going to start moving away from the settlement, and that leads them directly into skirmishes and frontier wars and conflict over territory, because they're not moving into empty territory. As much as they would like to claim they're moving into empty territory, that territory is claimed by various tribes. The first one they're going to run into is the Xhosa tribe, but the big one that they're eventually going to run into are the Zulus, and they're going to have to deal with the fact that they're moving into that territory and confronting them directly. So the Dutch, pretty nice in Europe, maybe other areas of the world, not so nice. This, by the way, is a high-quality meme. I'm very proud. I didn't make this one, I found it, but I'm proud of finding it. It's pretty good. So the Dutch are not the only ones that are interested in South Africa. In fact, all of Europe is pretty much interested in all of Africa. That's why we get this thing called the Scramble for Africa, where they, scramble for Africa, which mostly happens in the mid-1800s. But there's another European power who's very interested in trade. They have their own East India Company. It's called the British East India Company. So, of course, it's Britain. And when the Napoleonic Wars roll around in the early 1800s, Britain decides that's a really good chance to go in there and gobble up some territory. So they roll in and they take over the Cape in 1806. They set up more settlements as we get into the 1820s. And now that means that not only the settlement at the Cape of Good Hope, but also the territory that the Boer farmers are farming on, because they are still doing business with the settlement. They're technically under control of that territory once Britain claims that there's all of this territory is ours. So now they're under British control. And if they didn't like Dutch East India Company control, they're definitely not going to like British control. They start getting really resentful of this influence that Britain has on them. They don't like the bureaucracy of it. The whole reason why they left in the first place is because they wanted more independence. They wanted to do whatever they want, and the British are not letting them do that. This reaches a boiling point because the Boers might not be a big surprise here, but they don't have a positive view of Africans. This is a good time for me to bring up throughout this topic when the word African is used, not just within the context of our PowerPoints, but in pretty much any source you look at. African almost always refers to black Africans. Even though as we get into South Africa being its own country, technically any resident of South Africa would be African. When the term African is used for most of this topic, it's going to mean black people. So the Boers don't get along with the Africans, and they, in many cases, are basically using them for slave labor. So the British in 1833 abolished slavery, not just in Britain, but in their entire empire, which means the Boers would not be able to employ that slavery anymore. The Boers get pissed off, and they decide once again to leave. And they start this thing called the Great Trek, and they are going to move out of, British primary control territory and move further inland into the interior. Mostly this is going to bring them up to the north and then the east. So they're going northeast. The northeast is Zulu territory. And it's Zulu territory because they just won over, a series of victories that gave them control over the area, but they also decimated the area. So what we see is a situation really similar to what we saw in North America, where colonizing groups would come in, and they'd be like, wow, it's amazing, nobody's living here. In North America, that's because disease had come through and ravaged a bunch of the communities, so, people had been living there, but they were dead now. In this area, it's war had come through and ravaged the area. So there were people living there, just less of them, and a lot of them had died recently, but it was still Zulu territory. So obviously the Zulu were not going to be super happy with the Boers coming into that area. This is going to result in increasing violence and conflict, getting to this thing called the Battle of Blood River. And at the Battle of Blood River, the Boer forces were pretty significantly outnumbered, but they also had way better technology. We're looking at an industrialized Europe, so the Boers have access to all kinds of manufactured guns and supplies, and the Zulu, despite being one of the strongest South African or really African military forces in history, they were still working with, their technology at the time, which was buffalo hide shields and spears. So way more of them, but way less technology. The Zulu lose, the Boer win, and they establish an independent country, more or less, that they call the Republic of Natalia. They are then going to, moving forward, treat the Battle of Blood River as almost like a 4th of July, Independence Day style, massive victory for them, because, they beat those mean Zulu who were trying to bully them out of their own territory that they rightfully stole from the Zulu. Oops. Then the British decide they want more control. The British annex the Natal, which is the area that the Republic of Natalia would have been in 1843. And when they do that, they kind of tentatively agree to recognize Boer sovereignty over, Boer territory. But, overall that territory was British. And then a couple of decades later, in 1877, they're like, actually, you know what? Never mind. We're just going to confederate by force. So they roll in, the Boer then decide they're going to defend themselves as well, and this results in the first Anglo-Boer War. There's going to be a second one, that's why this is the first one, in 1881. The British actually lose that one in 1881, I should say. So the British are basically forced to kind of back off and recognize Boer independence until about 5 years later, because there's gold in them there hills. And there was already diamonds discovered in South Africa. So now you've got and not just a little bit, by the way. It's not like there's some diamonds and some gold. There is a huge amount of diamonds and gold in this area, and the gold in particular is in territory owned by the Boers. So Britain decides, all right, well, you're still independent, but you're technically under our control, and we're going to send some people in there. So we get a flood of non-Boers moving into the Transvaal, which is, and I'll show you guys a map in, I think a slide or two here to help get you the geography of this all down. So just remember right now they annexed the Natal, now they're moving into the Transvaal. This is the northeastern part of South Africa, and it's kind of the heart of Boer territory at this point. So now there's a huge number of non-Boers there. We also start seeing a lot of Africans, that's again black people, not the Dutch, moving into the cities because now that there's more jobs there and their territory is getting increasingly encroached upon. So this is making the Boers just overall not thrilled. And then those new residents of the Transvaal decide that they want voting rights, because the Boers up until now have been saying that, this is our territory, you can be here if you want to, but you don't get to make any decisions, we get to make the decisions. So now the non-Boers are like, well, that's BS. I mean, we should be able to get stuff too, we should be able to vote, we should have other privileges. The Boers keep on saying no, and we get the second Anglo-Boer War. Sometimes people will just say the Anglo-Boer War. That's always referring to the second one, because the second one is by far the bigger and more important of the two. But technically this is the second Boer War. And the reason why this one is more important is because Britain wins this time. And it should be pointed out, for a lot of when we talk about South Africa, the bad guys are definitely the Boer. But in the second Anglo-Boer War, Britain does something that is pretty messed up. The way they win this time around is scorched earth tactics, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically when you come into an area and you destroy everything. You burn down the farmland, you burn down cities if you need to, you destroy everything in your way to destroy the morale and take away resources from your enemy. And then they also set up concentration camps that they use to imprison hundreds of thousands of Boer women and children. And we're talking starvation, people dying, people being killed, just super ethical, totally normal stuff that you could use to win a war and not commit war crimes and stuff like that. So Britain wins, and now that means that they have control over South Africa. Every now and then there's one of those topics that for some reason just has a million memes about it. There's definitely a lot of topics within apartheid in South Africa where I had to reach pretty far to find anything, and a lot of times I just defaulted to primary source photos. But the Anglo-Boer War, there's a lot of memes about that. So here's just some extra memes for you guys about the Anglo-Boer War, because sure, why not? We got some Boer hypocrisy here about people taking their land, and the poor Zulus are like, wait, what? Yeah, you got some smug imperialism going on. It's all good. Best part, by the way, about distance learning is I no longer have to see people's disappointed reaction to my memes, so I'm just imagining that you are all just completely busting a gut right now, uncontrollable laughter, because these memes are hilarious. Here's that map I was talking about. So when I said that they annexed the Natal, that's over here, and then the Transvaal is up here. These are the two main Boer areas as we kind of move forward, but also during that time period. So now that the British have won, they control South Africa. And when you win a war, you of course have to sign a peace treaty, and the victor gets to basically dictate the terms. Surprisingly, the terms are pretty light on the Boers, considering this is the second time they fought, and the British and the Dutch have a history of butting heads over this stuff. They actually allow a decent level of self-government. This allows for a really quick reconciliation, so the British and the Dutch aren't going to be long-term enemies over this. They kind of reach some middle ground, which is let's just, agree that the British are technically in charge, but the Dutch get a lot of presence, for example, in the government. And the real people that are going to lose are going to be the Africans. So in 1908, they get together and they sign, after, a discussion, this thing called the South African Act, also known as the Act of Union. For some reason, by the way, a bunch of stuff in this topic has 2 or even 3 names that it's referred to by. And they are all commonly used. So sometimes you might see the South African Act, sometimes you might see the Act of Union. So you just get to remember extra terms, because I guess somebody at some point decided that one term was not enough, you just needed to add more in. So this Act of Union then created the Union of South Africa, thus the Act of Union. And this Union of South Africa was set up in 1910. And it had these 4 provinces here. So you can see a big part of this, again, they're being lenient with the Dutch. They're basically saying, hey, these 2 things can still exist, that's fine. And they even went so far as there's multiple capitals. There's 3 different capitals at this time in South Africa, because the Dutch want their own, and the Cape is way over here, but then you also need some stuff over here. It's a really weird setup where they're technically an independent state. They're a dominion of the British Empire, which means that Britain controls them, but aside from that, they're like Canada or Australia, right? They get to have their own stuff, and then they just do what Britain tells them to, if Britain tells them to do it. But again, like they're split up into 4 provinces. The Cape and Orange Free State are mostly British. The Transvaal, no, sorry, wait, Natal. Oh yeah, because Natal was annexed. Okay, I misspoke earlier. So Natal was annexed. It was previously mostly Boer. At this point, the Boers are mostly going to be in Transvaal and Orange Free State. Cape of Good Hope and Natal are going to be our mostly British ones at this point. And that's just kind of how they're going to decide to make things work. If, by the way, this all seems very confusing, remember, as I've also mentioned before, apartheid is a huge topic, arguably much, much, much bigger than like the civil rights movement in America, for example. But the IB doesn't really focus on it, so we're getting the super summarized version, especially of the background here. So sorry that it gets a little bit confusing sometimes. So this new state is very then kind of like multiple personalities. There's the British personality, there's the Boer personality, and then there's the African personality, which nobody really cares about because the Africans weren't really consulted on this whole union thing. They were just kind of dragged into it by the British and the Boer. So again, they get 3 capitals, partially as a result of this, but also because of just geography and distance. They are going to then have, in addition to multiple personalities and like politics and stuff, they're going to have very different views on Africans. The British are not really like nice to the Africans. Like you could see like British were part of the slave trade originally, right? Yeah, they do annex slavery or abolish slavery in 1833, but they're still not going to be treating Africans on equal terms or anything. But they don't really have any particular bad feelings against them, just like, you know, the normal racism and stuff you would get at this time period. The Boers, however, had the, you know, normal racism you'd have during this time period, but also remember, to the Boers, the Africans were and always had been the enemy. They were the ones they fought. They were the ones they stole territory from. That, like, the Battle of Blood River was against the Zulus, who, like, those groups of people are still around. The Xhosa that they originally struggled with are still around. So to the Boers, not only are Africans just, you know, subhuman because they're not white, they're also, like, unworthy of involvement in the nation. They should be used explicitly for slave labor, but again, we don't have slavery anymore, so you're going to have to find some kind of, like, alternative to slave labor. The Boers had an active, like, antagonism towards the Africans in South Africa. So again, notice that there was no consideration for Africans from the British or the Boers when setting up South Africa, which is also a really good example of, even though the Boers are more hostile to the Africans, the British are by no means like friends of the Africans in South Africa. There's no real hope for like the Africans to go to the British and be like, hey, give us some support, because the British aren't going to do it. Sorry, you know, meme over here. This brings us into a really important concept for this time period. This might be something that you've covered before because it comes up when you talk about like imperialism overall. It comes up when you talk about like World War II because Hitler subscribed to the same ideology. It is a very core belief of imperialism. It's social Darwinism, which then leads into eugenics. Social Darwinism is a belief used by Europeans, but then also Americans, to justify imperialism. And basically what it does is it takes Darwin's theory of evolution, survival of the fittest, and it throws in a bunch of pseudoscience to justify ideas of racial superiority and inferiority. And basically what the argument comes down to is survival of the fittest says that those who are most fit will survive. Therefore, if, for example, Europe and America are currently doing well, that must mean they are the most fit. And if they can come into a place like Africa and Asia, then clearly that means that they are just culturally and racially superior. They are the most fit people, and that's all there is to it. So they're allowed to do whatever they want because science says that it can. And in fact, they should probably try to get rid of and like eliminate, at the very least, the culture of these unfit areas, because you know, that if we allow that unfit like culture and race to survive, then clearly we're just weakening the gene pool. I mean, if we want to have the strongest species possible, we need to have the ones that are the most fit, which according to social Darwinists is Europeans and Americans. This obviously requires quite a bit of mental gymnastics. For example, by that logic, for most of history, China would have been the most fit. or sometimes like the Ottoman Empire, for example, would have been the most fit for a little while. But, right now at this point in time, it's Europe and America, so I guess we just get to say white people, sure, whatever. It also kind of misses the fact that the whole idea of survival of the fittest and evolution is specifically a biological, like, it doesn't really involve culture. There is no culture among animal kingdoms, and the theory of evolution was specifically among animals, and it doesn't involve culture. It also ignores the fact that the reason why Europe and America were the most fit is because they basically lucked into having the resources and conditions to industrialize first, but whatever. Sure, pseudoscience, it works. Social Darwinism then escalates into this thing called eugenics, which I always like to bring up. One of the early kind of developers of eugenics was a scientist from Berkeley. So that's interesting considering what Berkeley is known for now with that comparing to eugenics, but sure. So eugenics then takes this pseudoscience and makes it way, way worse. Basically, eugenics is all about identifying what the best racial groups and categories and characteristics are, and then breeding superior groups for the betterment of humanity, some heavy air quotes on that stuff, which then leads you to questions like, how do you figure out who the superior group is? And eugenics comes up with all kinds of answers like measuring skull width and length. And sometimes you would think like, okay, if you're measuring like, the size of skulls, then clearly like the biggest skull would be like the best because like, the biggest brain. But because you got a bunch of white scientists deciding this, and they often find that, for example, African skulls are bigger than white skulls, it's not actually the size, it's like the quality of the skull. And like they make all these like classifications for it, which have no actual bearing in science. And then they pass it off as like an actual scientific field. So if we're looking at the idea of bettering humanity, this doesn't just mean that you need to improve the superior groups. It means, like I mentioned earlier, the inferior groups need to be disposed of, or at the very least separated so they can't, weaken the blood of these superior groups. If this is sounding really familiar, it's because this is pretty much literally Hitler's idea. Like the word Aryan actually comes from eugenics. And Hitler kind of picks up on that and goes into that. Hitler's not the only one that did that. America actually was pretty big on eugenics in the early 1900s, and there were 30 states that had sterilization laws targeted at inferior groups, especially anybody with a mental or physical disability, which would be forced sterilization to make sure that they couldn't, spread their bad blood to the rest of society. In South Africa, oh, that's an underscore, not a hyphen. Oops. Well, I'll have to fix that at some point. In South Africa, eugenics then mixes in with this existing anti-African mindset, and is going to be kind of the cornerstone, or one of the cornerstones of apartheid thinking. The way they're going to justify all this stuff we're going to talk about is with a bunch of, political and economic stuff, but also with eugenics, and they're arguing that this is the natural state of Africans, and we need to protect white Africans from black Africans, and all these other just BS ideas. So apartheid is really about the segregation of South Africa. But one of the reasons why I think it's important to cover this background stuff early is apartheid is not the beginning of segregation in Africa. Or South Africa in particular. South Africa is actually starting to be segregated from the early 1800s. Keep in mind, our apartheid period doesn't start until 1948, and the first legislation we're talking about in this background here is 1856. That is damn close to 100 years before apartheid even starts, and we're already seeing the segregation of South African society. The Afrikaners, the Boers, and by the way, if you see Afrikaan with like the K there, that's generally referring to that Boer, that Dutch side of things. There's actually like a language that is spelled the same way. So Afrikaners or Boers, it's the same group. They were more aggressive with it, but Britain, as I mentioned before, also has a lot of areas where they're guilty with this as well. Britain is by no means innocent. So in 1856, we get the Masters and Servants Acts, which basically make it a crime to breach a contract, desert a job, go on strike, or, and these are official terms within the legislation which allow for a lot of subjectivity, to be insolent or negligent. So courts then could find people guilty for this. They could fine them, they could imprison them, And the courts ruled that even though this is technically a blanket rule, the courts really only care about unskilled labor, which was done very heavily by blacks, which means this is basically anti-black legislation. And what's important here is, remember what I talked about before, the Boers, the Afrikaners, are looking for ways to basically replicate slavery. And what does this sound like? You're not allowed to breach a contract. You're not allowed to desert a job. So you're basically not allowed to quit. You're not allowed to go on strike, so you can't demand better conditions. If they say no, you just have to accept it. You can't be insolent or negligent. So if you're not working hard enough, I guess they could decide that. This sounds a lot like slavery, and that's what it's trying to accomplish there. The British government of the Cape Colony then, in 1853, so even before 56, distinguished between civilized and uncivilized people. That's the exact terms they used. They didn't clearly mention race when they did this, but it was also equally clear that they were targeting black residents by the way they categorized uncivilized and civilized. The uncivilized qualities basically exclusively applied to black residents, especially of cities. If you were uncivilized, you were required to carry a pass with you, like a pass book. It had your information in it. It had where you were going, where you lived, like your work information in it. If you're traveling outside your home or your workplace, you needed to have this pass book with you, or else you were in violation of the law. So having laws like these made it so Africans were stuck in low-paying, bad jobs, unskilled labor. They couldn't leave or demand better conditions. They were unable to do anything about it because they don't have representation in the government, so they're just stuck with it. This gives the British and the Afrikaners cheap, disposable labor that they could use, for example, in mines. Remember, a bunch of diamonds and gold out there. Who's going to work in those mines? That's back-breaking, dangerous labor. You don't want to pay people a lot, so you get basically a captive workforce and force them to do that work for you. As then, like that mineral revolution, right? We start seeing more Africans moving to the cities. Residential segregation is going to be the next thing that occurs. We start seeing white areas that are established in, the good parts of the city and the city proper and the city center. Curfews are put in place so that black people are not allowed to be in the white areas at night. There's actually sections of the city that are classified as white areas. And like if it's during the day and you're there on like work, you can go in there if you're black. But if it's night, you're not allowed to be in there, and you will be arrested if you are. And again, this is mid-1800s. This is nowhere near apartheid, and we're already seeing some pretty intense segregation going on. So, and again, a lot of this is from the British. Like the Masters and Servants Acts, that's more of like, you could argue that's a Boer thing, but like British government of Cape Colony, that's civilized and uncivilized right there. So the British are just as guilty in this process. So as we get into the actual like act of union and the Union of South Africa, the first party that we're going to see in power is the South African Party. And interestingly, despite the fact that the Boers, the Afrikaners, are the ones that lost the Second Anglo-Boer War, a lot of presence in this new government is going to be Boer. The South African Party, in fact, is going to have a lot of Boer representatives. And it's really significant here that when we see the population of South Africa, as we'll see later, there's classifications. There's white, colored, and black. Technically, Bantu would be the third one, but that meant black for them. Colored and black people are either not given the right to vote or have very limited ability to vote. So if you're like, wait a minute, how did the British and the Dutch take over? It's because they're the only ones for the most part that get any kind of political representation. So the leaders of the South African Party, Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, both of which are Afrikaners. There needs to be an "and" in between those two words. Man, I got a bunch of typos in this. I'm going to blame it on the terrible program I had to use to make this stuff. My next one is in Google Slides, which makes me even more sad. So the leaders then, especially Jan Smuts, are going to immediately start kind of consolidating and expanding out that segregation that we had seen previously that had been building up in the 1800s. So in 1911, for example, one of the first things they pass is the Mines and Works Act, which says all skilled and semi-skilled jobs in the mining industry only for whites. So notice at this point that the previous segregation laws didn't necessarily directly use racial language. The closest we got was that civilized and uncivilized thing. And we're skipping a lot of stuff that happened in the late 1800s, but again, it follows that pattern. But we're now seeing just flat out racial language in it. If you want to be in a skilled or semi-skilled job, aka the things that pay well and offer you the chance to expand out your skills and to move up in the workforce, you have to be white and maybe like some colored people. Colored, of course, being like Indian, or maybe if you were like part black, but no Africans, no full black people are allowed to be in skilled or semi-skilled jobs in the mining industry. So that means that they're stuck with all the unskilled labor, the hard work in the mines. A couple years later, 1913, the Natives Land Act. This is going to be a precursor to a huge cornerstone of apartheid and one of the worst parts of apartheid, the homeland system. This goes, all right, we need to set aside some land, for the Africans here. So the Africans, they're 2/3 of the population, so they should get about 7.5% of the land. Again, 2/3, that means, 66% of the population, 7.5% of the land. And you better believe that land's going to be the best land available. No, of course it's not. It's the land that nobody wants. So look at our map over here, right? Ignore the kind of striped areas. Those are added later in 1936. So in 1913, look at the land that is being assigned to Africans. Notice pretty much nothing. I think there's like one little splotch down here by Cape Town. I don't even know if that's actually one of the lands. I think that might just be like an artifact on the map. It's all out here. It's all areas that people don't want. It's all areas with terrible farmland. It's all areas that people are not currently using. Or it's areas that allow close access to mines. Because keep in mind, a lot of this is where that mining is going on, right? The Transvaal out here, you need easy access to mine labor, so you want to have those people out there. That is your home now. That 7.5% of land is black land. And on that land, you are allowed to rent or own property as an African. Anywhere outside of that land, you are not allowed to own property. Not at all. It is officially against the law. You cannot own property. Obviously, then, if you got 66% of the population living in 7.5% of the land, you get horrible overcrowding problems. You have horrible economic problems because there's no way to make money. You are allowed to live outside of that land, but only if you're employed by whites. And remember, thanks to the Masters and Servants Acts, you're not allowed to quit those jobs if you have a contract. You're not allowed to desert. You're not allowed to complain. So what we're seeing here is some very Reconstruction era America style rules. Actually, this would be, it's kind of Reconstruction, getting into like black codes and Jim Crow laws of you have to work for a white person if you want to be off that land. And if you work for a white person, you have to do exactly what they say, and you're going to be an unskilled laborer, so you can't expand your working careers. And again, at this point, we're still 35 years away from the actual start of apartheid, but this on its own is an incredibly restrictive and terrible system to be living under. This gets expanded 10 years later with the Natives Act, also known as the Urban Areas Act. This said, kind of adding on to the Natives Land Act, cities are for the exclusive use of the white population. Any African found in a city without a pass can be arrested and sent to one of their native lands, the reserves that have been set up for them. Keep in mind, they might have no connection to those native lands. They've lived in that city, their whole life. But if you don't have a passbook now, if you don't have a documentation showing that you are working for a white person, you're screwed. You're now moved out of society. And now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of gray area with this because there's a lot of unskilled jobs in and around cities, especially, in the Cape over here, where they're going to need those black workers. So maybe they're not going to be like kicking them all out all the time. Or what if you have like the family of a worker? But at its base, this allows the white part of South Africa at any time to kick out whatever black people they want because they've got their own native land, which they have so graciously been given, and the cities are for the exclusive use of white people, so they don't belong there anyway. This, by the way, is a sign from later on in apartheid, and it's on a private farm, but I think it gets the idea across that we're seeing here pretty well, so I included it anyway. So as we move into the 1920s, the South African Party is going to be overthrown by a party that you're going to want to be really familiar with. It's the National Party. They are led by this guy, JBM Hertzog, and he's actually going to manage to even further accelerate segregation. He has a series of laws that are referred to as the civilized labor policy. And these have a huge range of effects, like things like, giving preference to white workers and hiring, further cementing the Master and Servants Acts, where the essential enslavement of blacks has now been pretty much fully enshrined within the mining industry in particular, because the Native Lands Act made it so that you've got a bunch of Africans who are desperate for money because they don't have any, so they'll take pretty much any job you offer them, and then once they get stuck in that job, they are basically slave labor, getting paid almost nothing for some of the worst working conditions possible, and if they tried to leave, they'd be charged with desertion. You also get more and more acts that are trying to mandate how people live their personal lives, like the 1927 Immorality Act, which said that if you are not married, you cannot have interracial sexual relations. If you are white and black and you are not married, sex is a crime. It is completely against the law. And again, we're still like 20 years out from actual apartheid. Then the Great Depression rolls around. And as we see all over the world, the Great Depression isn't just an American problem, because the entire world economy at that point pretty much relied on America. So it hits the whole world, and it hits South Africa extra hard. Because remember, what are their main sources of income at this point? They are diamonds and gold. Those are both luxury items. When you are in an economic depression, you don't buy luxury items. You buy essentials. Diamonds are not essential. And for a while, gold is essential because, countries are on the gold standard. But then during the Depression, a bunch of countries drop the gold standard because it limits how much money they can produce, and they need to produce that money. When the gold standard gets dropped, what does that mean for the gold industry? People aren't buying it. So now we've got an economic crisis going on in South Africa. Hertzog and that guy from the South African Party, Smuts, they get together to make this thing called the United Party, the UP, the UP. And they segregate South Africa even further. So prior to this, I mentioned that pretty much no Africans could vote, but there were some that had been able to vote prior to, the Act of Union, and that ability to vote was carried over. Well, now, if you're African, you do not get to vote at all in the Cape. Other areas, you got very limited stuff, but in the Cape, nothing. Instead, you get a Natives Representation Council, which is has a bunch of appointed leaders. Usually it's like tribal elders. They are allowed to voice the opinions of the African community, and then the government just ignores them. They have no real power at all because they get to voice the opinions, and then nobody has to do anything about it. They get no voting, but South Africa still gets to claim they're represented because, they got the Native Representation Council. They don't get to vote, but they get to voice their opinions, and that's enough, apparently. The native reserves are given more land during this time period. They up it to about 13% of the total land in Africa, so we're still looking at about 13% for about 66% of the population. But in exchange for that, the pass laws are now enforced even more strictly. So what looks like it could be a good thing on the surface is actually bad, because it makes things worse. And then World War II starts to roll around. We get into the 30s, and we're building up into the war, and Hitler comes onto the scene. And a lot of South Africans, especially the Boers, decide that Germany is where they're at. They really like Hitler and his ideas on eugenics. They really like what he's doing with the economy in Germany. They think he's got some pretty good ideas all around, and they decide that Germany is their go-to. Now, keep in mind, this is not the government. This is the people of South Africa. And they are going to form this thing called the Afrikaner Broederbond, the Afrikaner Brotherhood. They are going to be, as their name sounds, extremist nationalists. They start holding massive celebrations for both the Great Trek and the Battle of Blood River, basically treating them as like super significant, savior events for the people of South Africa. To give you an idea of how popular this group is, those events attract hundreds of thousands of participants coming out to celebrate this. And the big group of people getting drawn into this are lower class whites, because the United Party isn't really helping to improve the situation of the poor people of Africa. They're just trying to, keep things going and hold it out. They're not able to fix the Great Depression because nobody's able to fix the Great Depression, right? So this economic strife of the Great Depression, as it does in many other places, like again, that's a big reason why Hitler's able to come to power, because of the economic strife caused by World War I and the Great Depression. Well, just like it did in Germany, it encourages extremist nationalists in South Africa. So now we have this massive group of people that are supporting Germany and are against UP, and they're not happy with how things are going. And then Smuts makes a decision. Keep in mind, we got hundreds of thousands of people showing up to, celebrate this extremist nationalism. They support Germany. Smuts enters World War II on the side of Britain. Because remember, South Africa is a part of the British Dominion, the British Commonwealth. They are still technically owned by the British. So Smuts goes, all right, well, we're British, so we're going to join on the side of the British. Herzog resigns his post in protest. He's like, screw you, that's BS, I'm not a part of this. Public opinion turns away from Smuts even further, and then we get the return of the National Party. Technically, it's called the Reunited National Party now, but it's still just referred to as the NP, and it's still just the National Party. This National Party is just like the old one, with even more nationalist, even more Afrikaner viewpoints. And remember, the old viewpoints they had were basically use Africans as slave labor and control everything. So they've gone even further beyond that. In the background of all of this, despite laws against it, trade unions have been forming, especially when it comes to miners. A big part of these unions forming is going to be the South African Communist Party, that thing that you guys, learned about and wrote about earlier. And in 1946, about 100,000 gold miners are going to go on strike. And this starts escalating and getting really big until, police come in and they start opening fire, they kill several strikers, and the strikes are put down. So we got our, communism connection over here, because yay, communism. Smuts then decides we got to figure out what just happened. He establishes this thing called the Sawyer Commission, and they decide to investigate what's the best way forward. And the results from the Sawyer Commission are that African urbanization is unavoidable. Even if you pass laws to keep them out of the cities, it's still going to happen. African unionization and working is still going to expand. So the best route forward is to normalize black presence in cities, ease the pass laws, and kind of let them into society, because otherwise this conflict is just going to get worse. Surprisingly, Smuts actually listens. The United Party's policy going into the 1948 election is this. They basically argue, hey, we don't like Africans either, but look, clearly things are getting bad, and if we don't fix them, they're just going to keep on getting worse. So we got to do something to address this problem, and that something is normalizing the presence of black people in cities. Guess who that's not going to make happy? This crowd. This kind of person right over here. That's who that's not going to make happy. So the National Party, in response, forms their own commission called the Sawyer Commission, and the Sawyer Commission comes to a very different conclusion. The Sawyer Commission's conclusion is that the survival of the white race in South Africa is dependent on preserving the country's exclusively white identity. Man, that is a sentence and a half. The survival of the white race is dependent on preserving their exclusively white identity. So this is definitely some of that, deep South civil rights, like pro-segregation white person thinking of, this line, like black domination, white slavery, never. I mean, they're currently doing white domination, black slavery, but I mean, like, it'd be the worst thing in the world. And how do black people living in cities equal blacks or white? I don't know, whatever. You can't argue with that kind of logic, I guess. So the Sawyer Commission is the exact opposite, and basically says that the only way that you can conserve the survival of the white race is to make even more restrictive policies, to reverse any kind of black urbanization and completely separate the white and black races in South Africa. So the 1948 election then comes around, and what we have is the United Party making a complex, unpopular plan that basically says, look, we need to accept the presence of black people, and we're going to have to do that by a series of small changes and kind of, tweaking and adjusting as necessary, compared to the National Party, who has the very popular and simple opinion of just kick out all the black people. So guess who wins? It's the National Party. And when the National Party wins, that is going to be the official start of apartheid. I do want to point out, by the way, I make it sound like it was like a really clear-cut, like super big victory for the National Party. It's actually pretty damn close. So the United Party actually got more votes overall, but they work in a parliamentary system, so those votes don't actually directly correlate to the number of seats that they won. So the National Party gets less votes, but they get more seats, and that's what matters in a parliament, is how many seats you control. So now the National Party is the majority party in parliament, which means they get to choose the leader, and they get to kind of drive the laws, because that means they're going to win every vote, right, if they have the majority of seats. So the National Party wins, but barely. It's not like a super convincing lead here, right? And if you're like, wait a minute, those are really small numbers, remember who's allowed to vote in South Africa? Just the white people. So, those numbers are going to be very reflective of that. That also is a good reminder when I mentioned that hundreds of thousands of people showed up for those, the Great Trek and the Battle of Blood River celebrations. When you've only got about 1 million voters, hundreds of thousands of people, that is a lot. That's like millions and millions of people showing up in America. So, we are now at the official start of apartheid, and that'll wrap us up for our notes here, because as you can see, there's nothing at the end. It's just click to exit presentation. So we will be moving forward. We'll have a quick legislation activity before the next set of notes, and after that, we will move on to our nature of apartheid. Remember that I am going to be having air quotes office hours here if you had any questions about these notes. I will make sure that I'm available probably on Zoom. I'll post the exact information at the start of the week, probably from like 2 to 3, and you could just pop in and ask any questions you had. So thank you guys. Have a good day. Bye.